it's something I spent many years trying to really understand, and I realized that I simply can't. I think to understand what life was like in 1937, 38, 39 in the Soviet Union is almost impossible for someone living in this period. Despite all of our, all the documents we have, all of the memoirs, all of the historical records, I think in a certain way it's simply impossible because it was something akin to mass psychosis.
I think I'm especially interested in your grandfather, Vasily, your paternal grandfather. Although we should say that there are many stories in the book. Uh, he's not the only character who gets investigated, but Vasily, you sort of weave his rememberings and misrememberings and refusals to remember into a story of survival.
Right.
And I was really interested in that, as you know, that terror is random. Terror only works if it makes no sense.
Right.
If you can't make a calculation about whether you're going to survive, or even if you attempt to make a calculation, you can't be certain there was the right calculation, right? Terror works by creating a credible threat to everybody but picking only certain people at random, right? Yeah. And so that, and I think, in particular, sort of Soviet terror was really, really random, right? Because it was also suicidal. So it made no sense.
It was directed inward, yeah, of course.
Yeah. And so I think this is a problem for anybody who writes about the Stalinist period in Soviet history, where you make sense of something that didn't make sense, right? And when you create a story of how somebody survived, how well can you reconstruct the reasons for something that worked without reason?
That's a really, really good and subtle question. I mean, the Stalinist era is it's such a paradox, right? Because it was terror directed at the residents of the state by the state, right? And often by quota, and of course it's full of these incredibly absurd moments, right? Stalin sitting there asking, Kaganovich, what about that? Remember that opera singer in the 30s? What happened to her, Lazar? And he would say, well, we had her sent away. And Stalin would say, oh, that's a pity. She really had a lovely soprano, and it was just absurd, It was a kind of, there wasn't any plausible reason for it anymore. After a while, it was just understood that it was happening. And one of the really interesting things that happened around this book and in the book was my attempt to kind of reconstruct who my grandfather was and how he managed to survive, because it was actually really difficult to figure out. And I eventually ended up speaking to two of the leading Stalin scholars in the world, Simon Sebag Montefiore in England and Stephen Kotkin at Princeton, who, is writing a 3-volume biography of Stalin. And even, with their help, there were just so many caesuras that I couldn't fill, right? But essentially, Stalinism worked by keeping people in the dark and at every level of power, right? So, and I don't even know if at the end Stalin himself knew the entirety of what the machine was doing, right? But of course, and terror, as you said, requires an absence of knowledge, requires suspense, requires, the withholding of information. So, it began with going to various libraries and finding this really strange book. I think it was written by Robert Conquest in the 60s. And it was a book it was literally lists of people, of employees of the KGB and the NKVD who had any kind of distinction at all, who had gone to party congresses, who were awarded orders, who were sort of in leadership positions all through the second half of the 1930s. And my grandfather is nowhere in it. So, this is strange. He was, he had started off his career very promisingly. He was this secretary for communist youth at the NKVD Academy, and I started to piece it together, because, and what it turned out is he was working for both uh, Stalin and Beria, for who were in two different branches of the state. The bodyguards corps, which was separate from the KGB, which of course Stalin didn't trust, or the NKVD, I should say, is what it was called then. Um, and there's this very strange episode at the end where Stalin dies, and my grandfather is sent to work as a guard at a labor camp in Siberia, and I said, well, and that's clearly not what happened. He went to Vinica, as it was called then, with my family, and I know that because my family, moved there. And I said, what happened? Why did you? Because in Svetlana Aluva's memoir, two bodyguards immediately shoot themselves when they hear that Stalin has died because they know what's coming. They know that they're about to be purged. And sure enough, everyone connected with Stalin is either shot or, imprisoned or sent to work in the Gulag. So, my grandfather said, I went to Beria and I asked him to transfer me. And I said, you went to the acting leader of the Soviet Union and asked him to amend his own order, So I was dealing with these kind of almost, things that I simply didn't have the equipment to understand. And to a certain degree, these details will never be sorted out. But it was partly, an attempt to kind of swim in this soup of history, and to also try to understand where I was lacking information, where my grandfather might be misremembering, where he might be lying or dissembling. So in a sense, there were so many moving parts that in a way the book became about the impossibility of certain knowledge, the impossibility of, nailing any of this down.